Thank you all for being here. I think we still got a few to show up, but let's get started. My name is Ted Helms. I'm the Executive Director of the Chamber. Very excited about this event. I think it's consistent with what we try to do, which is to bring understanding and communication between Brazil and the United States. I have a particular interest in this event because I, for 17 years, was with Petrobras and was there as Lava Jato began unfolding. And one of the things that maybe I learned about myself and my understanding is that I really have a hard time understanding the judicial system in Brazil, how it works, how then all of that translates into, and ultimately now, what's happened into the elections. And so I was fortunate enough that I met Andrea and Jota and learned about them. I'm actually very impressed with Jota. For those that don't know, it's basically these are ex-journalists, or maybe still journalists, I don't want to take anything against them, and who have now created really a very interesting organization that does, I think, deep and serious journalism and research on legal issues. And so Andrea has put together this event to help us with all the politics. And sort of final comment, well, two things. One is that, and we, the Chamber, want to present this. Should be mentioned that we're always very neutral in our politics. We just want people to understand and know what's happening in Brazil. Second thing is I see as we're putting this together and how it all works, we might do something in the U.S., you know, and the president, and our own president, and how that legal process will play out. But that's for another event. But anyway, I'm going to turn this over to Andrea, who's done a very careful job of being moderator, and it's your show, Andrea. We do have microphones there in the back if we want to just put those, or if people want to use them. I speak, yeah, I grab one. I speak loudly enough that I think I don't need one. So.
Now I think it's on. Okay, well, thank you, Ted. Thanks all of you for coming in this very cold morning in New York. My name is Andrea Moura. I'm Director of Operations of Jota in New York, in the United States actually, in New York, in DC, and wherever else Jota takes us. And we have three very distinguished guests here today. Felipe Seligman is Jota's co-founder and partner and an expert in the Supreme Court in Brazil. We have Flávio Jardim, who's a lawyer at Sérgio Bermudes and a student of the judicial systems in the US and Brazil at Fordham School, and a former clerk at both the Superior Electoral Court and the Supreme Court in Brazil. And last but not least, Maurício Moura is my favorite pollster in Brazil, has been studying the trends of the Brazilian electorate for over 2 decades, and is going to talk to us a little bit more about how the political scenario is shaping up in Brazil today. So for the lawyers in the audience, I think we have a few. You might be familiar with how difficult it is to explain the Brazilian judicial system to foreigners. That's why Jota is in business. It's particularly tricky when you have a year like this year, where you have justices and judges sort of helping shape up what might be the most consequential elections since democratization of Brazil. It's definitely not every day that you have the front runner of an election convicted of corruption in one of the biggest scandals in history around the world, actually, or that we have such uncertainty that we are not sure who's actually going to be able to run. And to understand a little bit about what's happening in Brazil and how that's going to move forward, you need to understand a bit more about how the criminal system works, how the electoral system works, and where and when they cross, which is why we have this very good group of guests here today. I will start the conversation by having Flávio explain a little bit about how the justice system works in Brazil. And then we're going to move on to what's happening in the country at the moment and why this is so crucial. And we're going to discuss a bit more about what's shaping up in terms of voter preference. And of course, at the end, I'm going to open up for questions. So please feel free to start thinking about them as we go forward. And I'll have Flávio get started.
Hello, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for like to thank Andrea for the invitation. I would like to thank Jota VP as well, my good old friend from Brasileiro. Jota is a very good website. I think it's the country's best in legal matters. And I would like also to thank Sérgio Nascimento, who's here. He's currently a clerical athlete, and he's a partner from Sérgio Bermudes in São Paulo. He's the one who referred my name, so I would like to especially thank him for that. So, talking about the Brazilian judicial system is very hard, as everybody has already said here, and especially in 10 minutes, which is the time that I have here. So I'm going to pretty much just say a few words about legal security, which I think is the most important matter for foreigners and the ones that are most concerned about that. So what can I say about that? First, regarding legal sources, the sources of Brazilian law, we are a country with civil law traditions. We pretty much have understanding that our laws are all enacted laws, so we just have written laws. But and that's pretty much how judges work. They don't think they write laws. They don't think they create law. They just think they apply the law. But that's not really true. If an American lawyer goes to Brazil and take a look at one of our statutes, he will notice that our statutes are really not well detailed. If you compare to the American statute, we pretty much write laws in a very broad sense. We usually write open texture terms and a lot of principles, and so pretty much judges have a lot of room to reason based on these principles. So that's why you see a lot of decisions in each or one of other way, and that's pretty much because we have not very well written laws. If you compare to the U.S., in which when you legislate, you have a pretension at least to try to be more clear on specifics. So we don't have, for example, a fair notice tradition of on the light of precedents. We don't have vagueness doctrine. We don't have overbreadthness doctrine. This is not very developed in Brazil. When a law comes out, pretty much what we think is that judges will interpret them, and if there are pretty much, let's say, some gaps or there's some gray areas, judges will say that. So sometimes you just find out what the law is in a civil lawsuit or in a criminal lawsuit. So regarding legal sources, that's what I wanted to say. Regarding the judicial system, we have the constitutional pretty much draws all, explains, establishes all the courts we have. We have a Supreme Court, as the U.S. does. It's not a constitutional court because it's the upper court of the judicial branch. So you can appeal to the Supreme Court. They do not only decide constitutional matters, the constitutional cases in a strict sense like European courts. Our Supreme Court also has original jurisdiction to trial politicians. So federal congressmen, federal members of the Chamber of Deputies, of the Senate, and ministers are directly tried by the court. And the Supreme Court has a broad range of matters that it decides. As most of you are aware, also the Supreme Court rules in public, so you'll see a lot of debates, and pretty much they don't have the proceeding that the U.S. has, that judges rule in private. They only announce the opinions in public afterwards once they are rated. So we have 11 justices, and these justices, one of the most important aspects that an American lawyer must know is that the Supreme Court does not have discretionary review. So pretty much the Supreme Court has a jurisdiction over a case. It's mandatory. They have to hear the case. In some areas, for example, in abstract review cases, which is one of the basic type of review the Supreme Court does in Brazil, in which you don't have a specific lawsuit, you don't have a litigation going on. It's pretty much an abstract, because some entities under our law have special standing to initiate a direct process before the Supreme Court to have them review a matter under our Constitution. And you see that these cases, people, if you once file, they cannot even give up the case if the Congress settles the matter. So it's mandatory review always. They don't have discretionary review. Also, regarding our criminal law system, we don't have plea bargaining. So this is something that the U.S. does. Now we see a lot of collaboration, and some people mix that with plea bargaining. It's not the same thing. So even in Brazil, if you confess a crime, the prosecution still has to try the crime. Confession is not seen in an absolute evidence, so that's not going to entail a sentence of conviction. So there's a lot of case load on criminal matters. That's why sometimes it takes long for a crime to be adjudicated in Brazil. And you also have a huge line of appeals that you can go. You can go to the next upper court. Then if you have a statutory matter, you can go to the Superior Court of Justice. That's our highest court in terms of statutory review. And you can go to the Supreme Court if you have a constitutional law matter. And you will say, oh, but that's probably rare to happen. It's not that rare because our tendency in Brazil is to constitutionalize matters. So, for example, here in the US, you have a lot of controversy of disagreements regarding how to interpret the Constitution. In Brazil, such controversy is not that big. Nowadays, it's getting strong because the press and some scholars think that the Supreme Court has been too much activist. But in the sense, we have a general understanding, pretty much what happened in the US during the legal process years, that the Constitution should be interpreted in a new constitutionalism way, if I can put it that way. So you have an analytical constitution as ours, and the Supreme Court reads it as let's say, a self-enforceable document. It's not a mere political document. So, for example, if an abstract right is written in our Constitution, you can file like, for example, right to health protection, or right to education, or right to environmental matters, and this all become lawsuits, and this all become judicial questions. We barely have a doctrine of political question, so the judiciary really interferes in a lot of matters. And finally, my last remark is about stare decisis. Stare decisis, as you know, is the doctrine of precedent that is very common in common law countries. We don't have that as a culture. So Brazil follows the tradition of civil law countries. Civil law countries think that enacted law is the source of law. So judges are pretty much, they swear in to protect the law. And precedents are only an interpretation of the law. So we only we only have binding precedents when the law says that precedent is binding. So when the law says the precedent is binding, a judge will probably follow it. But when the law doesn't say that, the precedent only has what we call a persuasive effect. So judges may read it, they may say, oh, this is a good precedent, that's a good interpretation, so I'll follow it. Or then judges may say, no, I disagree with that, so they go another way. So in order for Brazil to have settled law, for a matter to be settled, it takes much more time than in the US. Because lower court judges don't really need to follow the upper court decisions only when the codes tell them to do so. Oh, Andrea, that's pretty much how I'm going.
Perfect. I think that's as perfect as you can get a summary in 10 minutes, which is an impossible task that I gave Flavio, so thank you very much. And I think it explains a little bit why sometimes we have such uncertainty as to how the judges will decide a case, and we try to understand how the judges have behaved in the past. We take a very good look at judges in Brazil when there's a case being tried, more so than I think in other countries, because they have such an important individual role in defining how the law is going to be applied in a case. So Felipe, you have the next difficult task, which is to take the very good background that Flavio gave us and apply that to the situation we have in Brazil today, the political system, because as you know, we have one potential candidate that has been convicted, whose conviction has been upheld in an appellate court, and it's still unsure for everyone whether or not he's going to run, whether or not he's going to go to jail. But he's not the only one. We have several other politicians that are potential candidates for presidential elections and other elections in Brazil that have their entanglements with the law this year. And it's pretty unclear to everyone in Brazil. I just got back this Monday from Brasileiro. It's unclear to almost everyone how these elections are going to turn out. So Felipe, give us a little bit of a panorama of what you're seeing today in the electoral system based on the judicial system and how they're behaving.
Sure. Can you guys get on? Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ted and Flavio, for this great background. I think this explains a lot why the scenario now in Brazil is really uncertain. And basically, I would say that the biggest uncertainty in Brazil is related to Lula, because he's leading all the polls. He's a strong candidate. He's still very important political leader for a lot of Brazilians there. And he's actually in the media almost every day saying that he doesn't have a plan B. He will run, even though he was convicted last year, with the conviction confirmed in January this year. And why this is complex and why there's an uncertainty? If there's a law that calls the ficha limpa, that will be a clean records law that prevents someone that was convicted and had the conviction confirmed to run. That's because whenever you have a conviction, this of course affects the electoral process. Whenever you say that you want to run for president, but it's not automatic. So you have the criminal justice, the federal justice in which he was convicted, and you have the electoral justice as well. And there are two separate processes in which he will need to deal with in different two processes of law. So he's in bad shape in his criminal case. He was convicted, then the conviction was confirmed, then now he has a new small appeal that probably will be analyzed in the following 2 or 3 weeks, and that's it for ficha limpa matter. So he will be considered unable to run. But that doesn't prevent him to apply for running in the electoral court. This is not something that he won't be able to do it. What happened is, in August, and this is a process that didn't start yet, so in August, he will actually go to the electoral court, and he will say, okay, I want to be the candidate I want to run for president, and the electoral court will need to open a new process, an electoral process, that has a specific due process law in which they need to get some documents, they will need to interview some people, they will need to ask for the opinion of the prosecutor about the case of Lula, and this will have a time frame and a lot of also appealing possibilities. It has a line of appeals that he can push the time further, and during this time he's pushing the time further, he will be considered a candidate, so he will be running a campaign. And the unique situation is that if he's now considering to run and he can, nothing prevent him to prepare a campaign, he can start to record videos or thinking about social media posts and so on. He could even be in jail, and his lawyers go to the electoral court, register his candidacy, and we could have a situation in which Lula is in jail and is running for president at the same time. So this is why it's very complex, and there are a lot of questions about how you can solve this, but I think for now I would like to present the Lula's case to try to paint this picture of uncertainty, because Lula being a candidate messes with this political scenario and the results of the poll, and I think Maurício here can explain how this affects the election for this year in the campaign.
Yeah, well, all of this, of course, is still speculation. We don't know if that for a fact that Lula will file for his candidacy. We don't know whether or not he's going to be in jail at that time. We're talking about possibilities, but just the possibility of having a front runner in jail and campaigning at the same time and still polling first is just very unique. And well, I can at least say that we'd never get bored in Brazil. So Thank you very much, Felipe, for that explanation. And I think we can ask now Maurício, who has been doing voter intention polls on top of general trends for a very long time, and I think just finished one round of polls last week. So he has very fresh numbers to give us. Yeah, there you go. So I think we're going to be the first ones to hear the results of the most recent poll that Maurício has conducted in Brazil. And he can tell us a little bit about how this uncertainty and how the scenario has been affecting Lula's chances and other candidates. Maurício.
Andrea, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Flávio. Good morning. Every time I wake up and I try to analyze the Brazilian election this year, I feel some like deja vu feeling. I have a candidate that's saying that he's going to make Brazil great again. One thing I want to talk about a couple issues. First one, this is going to be an election that most of the voters are met with the system. I think one thing that the Lava Jato, the clean wash operation, the car wash operation made was all the parties in the minds of the voters are corrupt. So there is no more the argument that that party is more corrupt than the other party, that politician is better than the other one in terms of the honesty playbook. So I remember 4 years ago we ran a poll and asked your willingness, desire to vote for a candidate outside politics, kind of like an outsider. And the number in 2014 was about 25% of Brazilian voters. As of today, it's 55% of the voters want to vote for someone to be the president outside the traditional parties, traditional political system. What does it mean, outsider today? Well, the second question that we asked, what's an outsider? And for 60% of the voters, an outsider is someone with a clean record, honesty, transparent. So for the first time in the presidential election, I think honesty would be something to differentiate one candidate from the other, not like an assumption. As if you want to be president, if realistically you say, I'm honest, but as of today, the voters are going to look for the honesty. And what that means, for example, we asked about the car wash, the Lava Jato, that's supported by 90% of the population. Everybody supports Lava Jato. And for the first time, they feel that there is no selective process. So Lava Jato is going after all the parties. So this is a real sentiment. And if we ask them, if someone is in Lava Jato, but someone only is being mentioned in the Lava Jato scandal, they are not convicted, they are not even there is no case against them, but the guy was only listed, only mentioned. The 60% of the votes said that they were going to think twice if someone is related to Lava Jato. So this is going to be, so my first point here, this is an election that corruption and honesty is going to be a big case and a lot of big discussions. And so, and then we go to Lula. One thing that I noticed in the polls is that the Lula voters, who are the Lula voters? Lula right now sits on the popular vote, the lowest income segment of the population. And those people, they are very pragmatic because they related with the state service on a daily basis. They need the state to health, to education, to mobility, to everything. So what they say is that, oh, I understand Lula is not perfect. He may be a little bit corrupt, but by the time Lula was president, my life was better. So given that all politicians are corrupt, I have a good recall about Lula years. My income was higher, my consumption was better. So those are the voters, and they're mostly concentrated in the poorest areas of Brazil. So they're very pragmatic. And those voters, they haven't realized that Lula was convicted, because they don't understand this, what they were talking here, that we have a justice system, an electoral system, and they don't believe that the Lula, as a leader, as a former president, will go to jail. So that's my second point. And what I think is that because Lula is seated on 30% of the votes, that's a lot of votes. The key question for me is, what are the Lula voters are going to do after he's not able to run? And I don't know when, and I don't know how. So this is a key question that I ask. And I always try to push in my polls, my surveys to people, there is a great chance that he's not going to run. So which way are we going to go? And assuming that he is not going to jail, because for this low-income segment, if he goes to jail, there's a lot of symbolism that he's actually not only a corrupt, but he's kind of a really bad guy. So those people are going to look very fast to another alternative if he goes to jail. If he doesn't go to jail, his power of transferring vote is much higher. I always say that in Brazil we have Brasileiro that is famous to have candidates that they run until the 2 weeks from the election, then they got kicked out of the election because any criminal issue. And the candidates that they put in their place, they usually go to the second round. That happened twice in Brasilia, and actually one of the times was actually the wife of a former governor. And I remember she went to a debate and she didn't know how to speak, but she went to the second round. It was, the power of the transferring power was really high. So if Lula goes until September as a candidate, his transferring power is going to be great. But if he goes to jail next month, he's going to lose a lot of ground in terms of transferring votes. Many surveys, our estimates is that, imagine that Lula has 30 points on today. 1/3 of those 30 points, that they say that they're going to very likely vote for whatever Lula indicates. So he has a real, as of today, he has a real power with 1/3 of those 30%. The other 10 is a more it's more what we call the left mind vote. So they go to all other left candidates, like for example Ciro, Marina. There are some extreme left candidates, a lady from the Communist Party called Manuela, there's another guy that's from the extreme left called Guilherme Bolo. So there's 1/3 that goes in a more ideological way, more the left way. And there's 1/3 that people even go to the other candidate, the Jair Bolsonaro, that's extremely right. So there's a lot of second vote, the Lula voters, that the second option is Jair Bolsonaro. And there's a lot of Lula voters that if Lula doesn't run, they're not gonna vote. They're gonna do a no vote, or even they're not gonna go to the ballot. So there's and talking about this Jair Bolsonaro, when we ask those Lula voters, why are you voting for Jair Bolsonaro? He's the opposite of the PT, of the Lula. And they claim, and that comes to my third point, they say, oh, Jair Bolsonaro has the best proposals for security. And my point here is that for the first time since I run the surveys, security, violence would be a presidential issue. So usually it's very discussed under the state level elections, because the states have a lot of responsibility in terms of public security. But right now, and of course the president also helped that with the military intervention, or the federal intervention, I don't know what's the legal. So security, violence would be a key issue in the presidential election. So it's going to be discussed along with the corruption. Because usually the presidential elections are about the economy. But right now we have those two new topics that are going to be key for presidential elections. So the last point that I want to make is that those Lula voters, there are two. If he doesn't go to jail, Lula is going to have a lot of power on those voters to indicate, to nominate a possible other candidate. If he goes to jail, they're going to look very fast to another alternative. And that leaves an open election in that sense, because all the candidates are going to try to find voters as a Lula second option. And we're going to have a great probability that we're not going to have a second round with the two biggest parties in Brazil, PSDB and PT. So there's a great chance that one of them are not going to be in the second round, and sometimes both of them are not going to be in the second round. So there's going to be a new election cycle in that sense.
Yeah, in Brazil, since '89, when we had first elections after the latest dictatorship, we had one candidate that wasn't from PT and PSDB, which was Collor, who we impeached 2 years later. But since then, every election since the second round has been PT against PSDB. So this would be a first.
In '89, PT was in the second round.
PT was in the first round, just not PSDB. No. It would definitely be a first. That's another element that makes this election so unique in Brazil. But Flavio, we keep talking about Lula might go to jail, Lula might not go to jail, he might go to jail soon, he might never go to jail, he might go to jail back in September. Why are we so unsure? What is the latitude of courts like the Superior Court of Justice and the Supreme Court in trying, for example, habeas corpus that he's been requesting? They're requesting both courts right now. So how come that we are so unsure about how they're going to try? Because the facts of the law are the same, and they should be, and the facts of the cases are the same.
Well, Lula has been convicted by the Court of Appeals of the Fourth Circuit, whose headquartered in Porto Alegre. As you know, Brazil, in this kind of cases, corruption cases, don't go to jury. In Brazil, we only trial by jury, homicide, abortion, assisted suicide, so it's very restricted, it's special, yes. So what's going to happen? Lula can appeal to the Superior Court of Justice if he finds that his conviction has some sort of law violation, statutory violation. So that then the Superior Court of Justice will hear Lula's case. If what can happen with Lula is, until this moment, he has not been sent to jail. According to Brazilian law, that under the new precedent of the Supreme Court, which was decided in 2016, Lula can go to jail now because he has been convicted by a bench, a panel of judges. This was not always the law. Before we thought, and according to our understandings, that you had to have a final decision over the judiciary. So until the Supreme Court ruled the case, if you appeal up to the Supreme Court and issued a final decision, that's when you would go to jail. The Supreme Court changed this case law on this matter, so now Lula may be sent to jail. But he has filed a motion for clarification against his conviction opinion. So this motion for clarification has not yet been adjudicated. So it's going to be decided, I think, in maybe 15 days or something like that. After this motion is reviewed by the court, so the court may issue a subpoena and send Lula to prison. What can Lula do then? Lula can appeal. He's going to probably appeal to the Superior Court of Justice on statutory issues ground, and he can request for an injunction. So one of the justices, there are 5 justices, but there's one that is already been, he's the one who's called Justice Felix Fischer, may grant him an injunction for him not to go to jail. In the same filing, the same request Lula's lawyers will file, he may also say, look, please suspend my conviction so I can be qualified to run. So today, under the law, his conviction already produces the effect of disqualification for elections. So, but he can request, and the Superior Court of Justice may issue an injunction suspending this disqualification effect of the conviction. And Lula may also file, the same moment he's going to file 2 appeals, one to the Superior Court of Justice with statutory violations, supposedly he thinks that his conviction has. And the other appeal is going to be an extraordinary appeal to the Supreme Court, which will deal with constitutional violations. But the Supreme Court will just hear that appeal after the Superior Court of Justice finish its judgment here. So it's basically one opinion with 2 different appeals, but there's a line in which each of them will be ruled. So that's pretty much under. If Lula's big chance is to have an injunction either at the Superior Court of Justice or the Supreme Court to suspend his convictions. And you mentioned habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is also a possibility for him. He already filed a preventive one in order for him not to be sent to jail, but this habeas corpus was not granted. But he can file another one now if he's sent to jail. That's very weird, but that's how our judicial system works.
So if I poll either any one of you right now, would you be able to repeat everything? It just shows, he gave a very simple and great explanation, but it just shows how difficult it is and how complex the system is, which is why we're here talking to you today.
I gotta comment.
Lee.
You know, you have a precedent. It's not a Brazilian precedent, it's an American precedent. And that was Mayor Curley of Boston. he was convicted and he ran and he won. And he was in prison when he won the election. So I'm not saying that that could happen in Brazil, but it's already happened once in this country. And then I have another comment which maybe is better for a later time, but I'll mention it now anyway since I have the floor. In 1959, when I first went to Brazil, the Cariocas were very unhappy about the election. And they didn't like the various candidates. And they went to the zoo and they picked a hippopotamus, I forget his name. And they voted for him and he won. So there's always a possibility that a hippopotamus could win this election.
Well, there's other possibilities too. So in the most recent election for mayor of São Paulo, the first place was actually not the guy that won. The first place was blanks, nulls, and abstentions. So Mayor Doria actually came in second, but he was the first person to win, so that's why he won.
Everything can happen.
And in Rio as well. So that's another possibility that we're facing, that we have a very high number of abstentions and no votes and blank votes in Brazil, and that will make a candidate with very low number of votes actually come to the second round and maybe win. That's something that we're facing. So Felipe, to close up, well, this will never be closed, but another question that I have on Lula is on something that we've been hearing. Some people suggest in Brazil, which is sort of the compromise way, which it would be an agreement in the courts that Lula is not sent to jail, because that might be considered very socially difficult to handle, but he's banned from running anyways. So there's a suggestion that has been put forward by some legal experts. We don't know if that's going to happen, if that's even feasible, but how do you see this matter?
We've been talking a lot with justices and judges, and they try to analyze how would be the best outcome due to this uncertainty scenario. And usually they say that the best way possible would be Lula not going to jail, because if he goes to jail, the uncertainty and the stability of all the of this election will be even bigger, but also having a candidate that might not be able to inaugurate his term if he wins is also not good. So the best ideal scenario will be him not going to jail and he not running for president. So they, of course, and try to analyze that, and the justices, they talk a lot, like in Brasilia, not of course publicly, but they say that that would be a good compromise. It's not, we cannot say that this is some agreement that has been made or a wishful thinking discussions that in Brasilia is going on right now, but the fact is, both in the Superior Electoral Court and the Supreme Court, they have the same justices. So two justices from the STF also works at the Superior Electoral Court. But there's no real information about that. It's just a lot of gossip and people talking that Lula is probably saying that he will run to pressure the Supreme Court to take a measure and preventing him to go to jail. So this is the scenario right now. And I think there's another thing that I would like to add to Flavio, that is, if he goes to jail, I think his case gets priority in the Supreme Court, right? Because someone that is in jail has priority in habeas corpus. So the Supreme Court is trying to avoid this matter right now, because they know that the president, Carmen Lúcia, knows that it's not very popular to analyze this case right now, and make Supreme Court might maybe change the jurisprudence, because this that Flavio mentioned, that Supreme Court now considers and understands that after the upper court conviction you go to jail. This was changed, I think, last year or 2 years ago, and the vote was 6 against 5. And one of those 6 already said publicly that he actually will change his vote. So if the Supreme Court analyzes the case, likely they will change the understanding and will benefit Lula. So this is the actual scenario. So the president of the Supreme Court is avoiding to bring the case again, But if he's in jail, they will need to do that because he will be in jail.
Yeah, and it will force them to take up the matter. At Jota, if you follow our daily review, every day there's certain moves of people trying to pressure Chief Justice Carmen Lúcia to pressure Fachin, which is the justice that's in charge of analyzing Lava Jato, to try to have them bring to the plenary or to one of the groups of the Supreme Court the matter of the execution of the sentence after an appellate court. Because if that changes, then Lula is free, at least for now, until he exhausts all the appeals.
Free, but not like able to run, just free.
Because he still gets caught by ficha limpa.
Yeah.
So, very nuanced. And Maurício, we were just talking about that right before we started the panel. In the case that Lula is free, but still barred from running in the election, who benefits from that? How would that play out? Of course, this is a little predictive exercise, and it's just an exercise of an educated guess. But based on the polls and what you're seeing, what do you think happens if Lula is not in the race?
Just one step behind the Supreme Court in Brazil has never been so popular. Every time we run a survey, people are more familiar with the Supreme Court names and the players of the national soccer team. It's incredible. It's the first time that I say
that
this.
Also says something about the national soccer team.
But it's interesting because the judiciary system has right now in the minds of the voters, they appreciate a lot what the Lava Jato judges are doing. So they know the names like Sérgio Moro and Marcelo Bretas, but they think that every time someone goes to the Supreme Court, the politicians get a benefit for that. So it's very clear in the minds of the people that the Supreme Court is very nice with the politicians. So, and this is cross-income, cross-region, cross-age. I think this is a key question, Andrea. What happens if Lula goes out? One thing is clear: the candidates that are already in the polls, that are already running a campaign, are going to be and already ahead on the numbers, are going to be the most positively affected if Lula doesn't run. For example, the Bolsonaro, we will have some part of the voters from Lula. The Ciro and Marina will benefit from that. If the PT comes to a candidate, depends a lot on how Lula is going to play, if he's going to go to jail or not. So it's interesting that in different ways, all the candidates, the first four candidates, except what they call the more middle income, high income voters, that usually goes to the PSDB and goes to potentially some candidates like Rodrigo Maia, Henrique Meirelles. Those are probably the least affected candidates with Lula voters, because those are the people that usually don't go after the popular vote. But Marina, Ciro, Bolsonaro are surely going to gain without Lula.
I want everyone, if you want to ask a question, just start thinking about the questions now, because we're going to get to that very soon. But first I wanted to ask Felipe, because we've been focusing a lot on Lula, who may or may not be a candidate. But other candidates, pre-candidates, are also involved in judicial matters that might affect their chances in this election. So what's happening with the rest of this political scene?
Yeah. So you have a bunch of pre-candidates right now. All of them somehow, or I would say most of them somehow, are involved in Lava Jato scheme, because they are traditional politicians. They receive money in their campaigns. So there are a lot of investigations going on, but all of them are in early stages, and there's no time from now to the elections for them to get convicted and get actually affected by the ficha limpa law. So legally speaking, they are not as in a bad situation as Lula, and they will be able to run. Bolsonaro has also a case in the Supreme Court that he is being charged for insult and incitement to rape, I think, something like that, because he actually had a strong discussion with a congresswoman some few years ago.
He had a public fight with a congresswoman, and he screamed at her in the middle of Congress. He said, "I wouldn't rape you because you don't merit it." So he's been charged with insult and incitement to rape for that.
But the awkward thing about Brazil is that ficha limpa law will not affect him, because this is a crime against honor and against reputation, and the ficha limpa law only deals with crimes related to corruption and money laundering and so on. So he wouldn't be affected. I think that this, legally speaking, probably politically, Maurício will be better than me to explain how they could be affected, being cited in investigations like Lava Jato, because all of them, like from Alckmin to Meirelles, no, I don't think Meirelles, but Meirelles maybe not, but Rodrigo Maia, Alckmin has an investigation against him going on under secrecy in the Superior Court of Justice. Maia also has some investigations in the Supreme Court. You have, from PT side, you have Haddad, former mayor of São Paulo, also now under investigation. Jacques Wagner as well. So all of them are somehow involved in like bigger or smaller participations in aspects in those investigations. But all of them in early stages, we don't have time because they will need to be. There's a lot of investigation going on till the time when they get all of the cases get analyzed, and this will take at least a couple of years. So they, electorally and legally speaking, they are not as bad as Lula.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. As I mentioned, Lava Jato would be a huge liability in terms of reputation for any candidate, because he's going to spend the 45 days of the campaign basically answering what he's doing with Lava Jato, and it's going to be very tough because it's a kind of defensive argument all the time. And Bolsonaro, in every single speech that he does, he mentioned, "I'm not in Lava Jato, I'm not in Lava Jato, I'm not in Lava Jato." This is a kind of a good way to position himself. And so Lava Jato is certainly a great liability. Bolsonaro has kind of a Trump style, you know, everything he says, people that like him doesn't take like word by word, but take him seriously. And people that don't like him take word by word, but don't take him. So it's kind of, every time I see Bolsonaro speaking, I have like a deja vu, because he has a lot of similarities with Trump. He always claims that he's the outsider, he's out of the system, he's against everything that is there, that Brazil is broken. So it's kind of the same narrative. But one thing that will destroy his narrative, if he comes out with any corruption scandal related to him, will destroy him, because this is the core of his messages about the corruption. But one thing I'm 100% sure, and we test that in every single way, is that you don't want to be a Lava Jato involved in this campaign. That's for sure.
And some candidates have their cases sealed. They're running by secretly. So we don't actually know exactly what the accusations are or what they're involved in. And if that doesn't come to light before the election, then good for them. And I'll ask my last question to the panel. I'll turn back to you, Flavio, because we've had that comment here in the audience, and we all want to know how much precedent we have for candidates being in the situation where Lula is or others are in Brazil. And are this completely new waters that we're treading, or do we have anything to look back to try to predict what's going to happen?
Well, what I can say about the Lula situation is that it's a very controversial case. It may sound that Lula was convicted under clear law, but it's not really like that, to be really honest. And why? Lula was convicted under corruption charges. So, and pretty much what happened, probably you are aware what happened, but Lula, as the accusation goes, appointed some directors to Petrobras, which he knew, whom they knew that would be doing stealing and getting some money from contracts, from public contracts, a part of the money, 2%, 3%, and this would revert to the PT. But Lula was not the one who made the contracts. He was not the one who signed those contracts. So, for example, under the U.S. law, we have a very recent precedent from the Supreme Court, which is called the United States versus McDonald, in which you review your concept of official act, which is required in order for you to have corruption framed as a crime. So in Brazil, this debate is going on. So what the problem in Lula's official act, direct official act, according to the sentence, which was confirmed by the Court of Appeals, was appointing the directors. He did not sign the contracts. So this is something that has to be taken into consideration. I'm going to say something too. In 1994, for example, former President Fernando Collor de Mello was acquitted by the Supreme Court. His charges were corruption charges. The Supreme Court acknowledged that Collor got undue advantages, but said that an official act was not proved against Collor. So this is the same matter then is going to be discussed if Lula's official act is enough to configure, to characterize an official act. So I mean, Lula has a legal issue undergoing on. I think the evidence is very clear as to whether the benefits he got in related to the apartment. I think that the acquisition made a very good job on that matter. The problem is on the other side. One of the witnesses that testimony against Lula was the former president of OAS, which is a company, a construction company in Brazil. And this company has not yet entered into a collaboration agreement with the government, has not. So this witness is considered to be, under Brazilian law, a witness. But if they enter into a collaboration agreement, this witness can be turned into a collaborator, and you would need then further evidence in order to convict under our laws. So what makes the Lula situation is unique is that he wants to be the president. That's his problem. I think Lula would probably get an injunction and would not go straight to jail now if he didn't want to be the president. So that makes the situation harder, because people know, look, I can pretty much ask this guy to run. If he runs and wins, what happens in Brazil is that his previous criminal proceedings are suspended. So that's pretty much his way of avoiding the consequences of all of this immediately. So he's not going to be able to be sent to jail in the 4 years that he's a president. On the other hand, if he runs and then he loses and gets convicted, or if the result gets annulled because he went to second round, he's going to even be liable to pay for the whole election. So he's going to be broke. He's probably broke already, but he's going to be much broke now or not. So the situation is really hard to understand. But what I'm telling you about Lula is this: if he was not the president, or if he didn't want to run for president, we would have a legal issue in which important legal matters would be debated. But since he is, everybody's just, okay, he has to be disqualified now, because the mess he's going to cause is huge, so that's the thing.
There's also a discussion, even within Supreme Court experts and staffers, that say, are we able, or should it be our role to take away from an election the front runner? So this matter of the election really complicated the whole scenario for Lula and for the presidential elections in Brazil tremendously. I want to turn to questions from the audience. I'll come to you next, but you've spoken before, so I'll come here to the chat.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the panel. Extremely interesting. Mauricio, you mentioned this appeal for an outsider. So a couple of questions on that point. One is, how Bolsonaro could be viewed as an outsider if he's been in the Congress for those many years? What an outsider could be, what the population wants as an outsider, and in that point, is Luciano Huck this person? And you didn't talk about alchemy. There is this sentiment in the market that the two frontrunners, Lula and Bolsonaro, will fail at some point for different reasons, and the thing will just be open for alchemy. Do you believe in that scenario? Sorry for many questions.
No, so let's go step by step. Bolsonaro has the same Bernie Sanders wave. Bernie Sanders has been in Washington for 40 years, and he was running as an outsider. And one of the issues that people think that Bolsonaro actually was never in the executive branch. So he was never in charge of anything, actually. And he's always has been spelling all the government. He was always an outsider in the Congress. So people see him as the same way that people saw Bernie Sanders here. So that's not an issue in terms of the narrative. He can say, oh, I've never been the executive, I've never been there, I've never been a candidate for president, for governor, whatever. So that's his thought. What people want from an outsider, like I mentioned, something that is not related to corruption. I think Luciano Huck, Joaquim Barbosa, all the names that were mentioned as an outsider, they fit that profile because they are kind of outside politics. Luciano is very popular in the lowest income level because he has a TV show that runs every Saturday and it's focused on more low income segment. Joaquim Barbosa is incredible because he's admired by the highest income of the population, but he has a very strong narrative if he comes, because he can say that he's the anti-corruption guy, he's the guy that put politicians in jail. So both of them have assets, but the key asset is that they are outside the scandals, they are outside the corruption. Actually, alchemy is stuff. Because the good thing about Alckmin, he has a big party, and big parties have infrastructure on the ground, and it's an asset for him. He can claim that he has experience compared to the other candidates. He has actually done something in terms of the executive branch. Also, Ciro was a governor as well. But he's gonna have to deal with three things that are very tough, and I don't know how he's gonna do it. First one is the Lava Jato related to PSDB, and he's going to have to explain that, especially the Aécio Neves recording. The second one is that it's always been an issue for someone from São Paulo to run a presidential election, because people outside São Paulo don't think that São Paulo's agenda is the Brazilian agenda. So he's going to have to overcome that. And third, and he's trying to do this, PSDB is not exactly a united party, so he's going to have to overcome all those. On the other hand, if he manages to go against someone that's very extreme left or extreme right, I think he has a shot, because he can move into the center voter. So for him, it's going to be very difficult to go to the second round. If he goes to the second round against someone that's very extreme, he has a shot.
More questions? Since I made you wait.
That's okay. When is the election? When?
It's the first Sunday of October.
So the first round is 6 months or so.
Yeah.
All of you have been terrific, and I'm going to put the question to you because your explanation is superb. If you had to guess today, 6 months away, what would you say? Does the hippopotamus have a chance, or does Lula have a chance? I have my own opinion, but I'm curious about you. What would you say today? If you had to say, I'm putting you on the spot in particular, what would you say today if you had to make a speculation as to what would happen? What would you say?
I've been thinking about this answer a lot, and I was the situation I was imagining. It would be a pragmatic Supreme Court. Lula has today an habeas corpus there. I thought the court would take this and solve it immediately. So they would solve it in all grounds.
Right.
They would just be more activist than they should in non-regular case. They would decide the official act issue. They would decide whether Lula can go to prison immediately. But that does not seem to what's going to be going on. You know, this Andrea mentioned that the press has been pressuring Carmen Lúcia. Other judges have been pressuring her, and she has basically said, "No, look, I'm not going to send this back." She's taking a position very similar to what the Supreme Court in the U.S. did with that Planned Parenthood v. Casey, in which said, "Look, we have precedent here now. We decided this 2 years ago." And what is bad, because what the Supreme Court basically decided that somebody can go to jail after the second, the upper court conviction, but doesn't say that somebody has to go to jail. So in specific cases, you may grant the suspension of the conviction. So I think she thinks that the situation is solved, but her colleagues don't think that. So what's going to happen is that we're going to have a big litigation in the middle of the elections. And at the end of the day, I think Lula will not go to jail, but they will not qualify him to run. That's what I think is going to happen. Yeah.
We'll see if our crystal balls will be working correctly from 6 months from now. I have a number of questions here. I think the gentleman, yes, have been waiting.
Explanation of the Supreme Court and the Superior Court. What I'm unclear how the work of Sergio Moro in Lava Jato in the South relates to this overall court description. Are there regional courts, or is it a separate court, or how does that connect?
Sergio Moro is a lower judge. He rules by himself, so he takes care of cases. But he's a federal judge, so he analyzes cases regarding federal crimes. He's also a criminal judge. So why the case is there? Because the investigation started there, and they started to pull one thing and the other, till it brought the case to Petrobras. And he's the original judge for this case. So as the original judge, he's in charge of the whole investigations about Lava Jato. Of course, you have different kind of investigations related to Lava Jato. There are also in other places, like in Rio de Janeiro, you have all the pretas that takes care of the government of Rio, and Sergio Cabral, the former governor there. That's more related to local things, but Sergio Moro is the original judge of Lava Jato. So, but he is the lower judge. So he did he did his job already, and he convicted a lot of people. He's still doing some of them. Lula still has a case against him with Sergio Moro. Then Lula appealed to the upper regional court that is in Porto Alegre, because it's the region of Sergio Moro. Sergio Moro is in Curitiba, and the upper regional court takes care of the states of the south. So it's Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná. Then here, this is the two steps where you can analyze the case itself, so the proofs and what happened and so on. Then you have the upper courts, the national court. So you have the Superior Court of Justice that takes care of statutory matters, so ordinary laws, and then you can appeal to them, not to discuss the case itself, but some kind of ruling that happened during the trials regarding ordinary laws. And you can also bring these cases to the Supreme Court to discuss constitutional matters. Did I explain well?
It's pretty. He did a very good job. As I was saying, the legal issue that can be debated in the Superior Court of Justice is whether if you need an official act requirement in order to be convicted for corruption. So this is a legal issue. You don't need an evidence to that. The court already has heard all the evidence. But what happened with Sergio Moro, and Felipe did a good job, but just to clarify a little bit more, is this. We have a criminal chamber in the federal, we have a federal system and a state system. The state system is residual, so most of the crimes between citizens go to state systems, but the state courts. But the federal system takes care of federal crimes, which, as Felipe said, since this is federal money, because Petrobras is a state-owned company. It's not a state-owned, but it's controlled by the government, as you know. 51% has to be from the government. So that brought the jurisdiction to federal courts. We don't have juries. So Sergio Moro is the one who sentenced them for this crime. So that's why he's so powerful. It's funny, I heard the other day, like here in the US, who's powerful is the prosecutors or the DOJ and the lawyers. The judge is pretty much an umpire who you don't know the name really. In Brazil, it's the opposite, because the guy has the power to convict. And why Moro has so much power? Because since he started, the investigation, as Felipe said, started in Curitiba, and the Supreme Court said, look, we cannot divide this investigation regarding Petrobras, because otherwise we're going to compromise the evidence. So Moro is going to be the one who's going to hear all the cases, all the criminal cases related to Petrobras. And why the Supreme Court hear cases? Whenever there is a federal politician, they have original jurisdiction to hear the part of the federal politicians. But sometimes that can be hard, because you can have, for example, I am not one with original jurisdiction, but you are, and you're going to be in the Supreme Court, and Moura is going to be hearing my case, and both cases are related. So this is a little bit hard to deal. So, but anyway, that's the way it goes.
Paulo has a question.
Yeah. I mean, I have a question for Maurício. You know, there's always this juncture, and nowhere more so than in Brazil, between the professional politicians and the public, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you know, the parties themselves decide a lot of things, and they have a lot of power, because after all, you know, for example, if there is a coalition, you may not have much to choose, right? So my question to you is, how do the voters feel about that? I mean, if in fact there were, say, a coalition in the center, would the voters view that as a very negative evidence, or would they view that as a positive evidence for the political system?
Maurício, hold that thought. I'm going to get one more question because our time is running out. Paulo?
Well, if I may, I actually had two questions. One for Felipe. He mentioned that he expects the one vote to change in terms of being sent, the person being sent to jail in second round versus Supreme versus the whole process. So I know we don't know about Rosa Weber, but I would like to hear your personal guess. If she could also flip and therefore change that stance. So what's your best prediction there? And second question to Maurício, if you have the time, if he could expand a little bit on Ciro, considering that a lot of people think he's just going to implode himself as it has happened in the past. If he thinks this is a real risk, and if not, let's assume a scenario which seems likely where Lula goes to jail, and then he got an induction or habeas corpus or something. He's out of jail afterwards, but he doesn't run. He goes through the process of being a candidate, and then he doesn't run. So I guess this is the core scenario. And Marina might not run. I don't know your thoughts. But I don't know if Ciro is involved on Lava Jato or not, but I would like to hear your thoughts if you think he's a strong candidate or not on this scenario, because he's been in some pollings being the second one. And if he goes to Ciro Bolsonaro in the second round, who do you think wins?
So Maurício, why don't you take the two questions that are for you first, and then we'll go back to Felipe and the Supreme Court.
Actually, the lady that introduced me, Ciro, was Andrea, just for the record.
I had an event with him at the Atlantic Council where I worked before in Washington, D.C. It's not like we're personal friends.
About the coalition, one thing voters don't understand Brazilian coalition because they see the parties fighting each other in the federal level but joined together in the state level. For them, this kind of coalition is so complicated, the median voter. What they do understand is that when two personalities get together, so I think this is more important. If Marina joins a ticket with another candidate, then it's a different ballpark. They don't understand how the coalitions are structured. They don't understand winners and losers after the election. It's kind of Brazilian politics in that sense, because what they're seeing in their city doesn't relate anything what they're seeing in the national level. So there's places that PT and PSDB, they're together. There are places that PMDB is with PT. So it's kind of all over the place. So that's tough for them. So they look more on the personality. So for example, when Marina joined Eduardo Campos, this was something about the two personalities, Eduardo Campos and Marina, not about PSB or the Marina's party. Ciro, I think that Ciro has a good opportunity in this election for three reasons. First of all, I haven't heard any Lava Jato relation with Ciro yet, so this is good for him because it's going to be on the margin of that discussion. Second, there is a great chance that Lula is not going to run, and some voters of Lula, especially the more left-minded ones, can go to Ciro, and this is a real, and we are measuring this. But the most important one in terms of narrative, he's not going to be the only crazy in the elections. So having Bolsonaro is very good for Ciro, because both of them are very outspoken. So it's kind of, and he can be the opposite of Bolsonaro. This is good for him. He has a situation that he had never had before in a presidential election. The issues that I see in the second round for Ciro, if he managed to go to the second round, is that because one of the problems of the left is PT. Because Lula is over PT. Lula is a leader. He's over his party. So, and there is a high level of rejection of the PT because of Dilma, because of the corruption. So if Ciro goes to a second round, very close to the PT, he's going to have this liability. If he managed to go without like a open, direct involvement of PT, I think he has greater chances. And Marina is saying that she's going to run, but the issue of Marina is the infrastructure of his party, her party. Her party is very small, very new, and for example, they even had enough congressmen to go to a public debate. Because in Brazil, the networks they can invite the candidates for a TV debate based on the presence in the Congress. And Marina's party as of today is out of debates. Of course, they can invite whatever you want, but they are obligated to invite. And I think she has 2 congresses, her party right now. So it's very small, and without a minimum infrastructure on the ground, it's going to be very tough for her because she needs to connect with the more popular vote. The voters of Marina are basically the high-income class in the big metropolitan centers. She needs to go to the more the real Brazil, and without the infrastructure, it's going to be very tough for her.
And Bolsonaro versus Ciro, what's your call?
Depends what comes with Ciro. If it comes with PT, I think Bolsonaro has a shot. If it doesn't come with PT, he's favored.
And to answer Paulo's questions about Rosa Weber, yeah, there's these discussions that as Gilmar would change his vote, and this is not more a speech matter. Yesterday he gave a decision actually suspending a prison order, exactly changing his positions in a particular case, so that's now a reality that everybody expects that he might be the guy that will save Lula. But a lot of people talk about Rosa Weber, that is a justice that is very tough criminally speaking, and she voted actually against this possibility of sending someone to jail. And they said, okay, maybe she will say that, no, now the jurisprudence is there, so I will follow the jurisprudence, or she will be tough in the Lula's case, as she's been tough in all the criminal cases she's ruling. For instance, in Mensalão, she convicted Judicial and PT, and fun fact here, she had Sérgio Moro in her office during the Mensalão trial as an auxiliary judge. So she's kind of aligned with Sérgio Moro, but there's no concrete evidence that she will change. It's all matter of discussion and all. And you have a second factor now that as Carmen Lúcia is avoiding to bring the case to the plenary, they are talking about bringing to a small chamber that there is in the Supreme Court, formed by 5 judges. And in this, where Lava Jato is usually analyzed, is the second, how would they say, chamber, second panel of the Supreme Court. And there, Rosa Weber is not part of the panel, and Gilmar Mendes is, Lewandowski is, Toffoli is, and Fachin and Celso de Mello, and I think all of that 4-1 against sending someone to prison. If the case goes to the panel, it's more likely that Lula has a decision in his favor as well.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions from the audience, and we're going to wrap up very quickly. So I have one here. And that one there.
So
Yeah, those are the
it's
two.
actually 3 things, but very quick answers. The first one is, if you were to say, in a scenario where Lula is disqualified, what is the probability of him being disqualified early or later, right? In the sense that you'll say, you know what, you cannot even, because you don't have Fichalim, you cannot even get to become a presidential candidate, right? Very early in the next few months. There was a discussion on that. Question number 2 is regulation over online electoral. So is there do you think there will be any changes, or basically it's okay to do whatever you want online, right? Heading into, because clearly this is a big story now, and it could make a big difference in TV times and so on and so forth, right? So any commentary on that? 3, for the past 20 years, Brazilian elections were always decided by kingmakers, always, right? Sarney was placed by Tancredo, he placed Collor. Collor eventually was impeached, Itamar Franco placed a family Cardoso, Cardoso placed Lula, Lula placed Dilma, right? So it's pretty clear that whoever Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Temer decide that will win, right? So this, so what do you think is the probability that these two guys actually put themselves together, right? Because they cannot come up with an opinion. I don't think they ever talk, right? They can put themselves together and decide who is going to win the next elections.
Let me take the last question here.
Question for Felipe and for Flavio. So ultimately, if you step back, is the system working or not? Okay, so take away from the personalities, take away from the conflict. Are the courts resolving the conflicts themselves? How are we going to look at this election 10 years from now?
Very easy questions.
And sorry, is it for strengthening the institutions of democracy or not?
Well, I think the institutions are strong in a sense because, for example, the Lava Jato case has been a very, let's say, change of times case. You see a lot of people convicted, you see the police has independence, you see the judges that have independence. Nobody got killed, so it's the prosecutors have independence, the press has independence. It's a hard process. Can you imagine putting everybody in an investigation on how campaigns were run in the last 10, 20 years? You can say also you may have problems of due process. I think that because what happened is this, you have a law that now allows you to collaborate. So a lot of people have incentives to collaborate. And if you go to jail in Brazil, jails are bad. So nobody wants to really step into jail. So they want to collaborate easily. And this was a problem, for example, JBS and JBS, the largest meat supplier in the world, they tried to make a collaboration agreement. And I mean, for example, Odebrecht, I'm not a criminal lawyer, so I'm pretty much just studying this from outside. But Odebrecht took 6 months to do a collaboration. They probably hired 30 law firms. Each law firm took care of 2 or 3 directors, and they were reviewing everything they said. So I think, in my view, that's a very strong collaboration. JBS were 3 guys sitting down for 2 weeks saying, we bought everybody. So I mean, but what did you buy? Why did you buy? What was the quid pro quo? What they give you? No, we bought it. They couldn't even point out what the guy had done in favor, in exchange for the supposedly corruption. So I think some of these cases are very strong, and that's why this is going forward. It's not that everybody who's going to be mentioned in Lava Jato is already a corrupt person. So I think that you need rule of law in this sense, and that's to answer your question. Is it working? It's going to work if we just don't stamp everybody as a corrupt person. We need to have people proving. We need to have the burden on the public ministry on the accusation. And that's why I think, for example, a jury system here in the U.S., I was talking to Andrea about that yesterday, makes it more independent, because people are afraid. Look, if I play with the reasonable doubt burden here, one day I can be there. But judges in Brazil, they are the ones who sentence, and they are pretty much it's very hard for a judge to go to be a defendant in Brazil. So I'm afraid of that. But as far as it going and talking about, let's say, a process, an enterprise of improving the country, I think I have no doubt that it's a better system than we had 10 years ago.
So how about the question on the timing of the potential Lula arrest?
Exactly. So I also think that institutions are working, and eventually they will decide and they will end this uncertainty. But it will take a time. So I don't believe, to answer the first question, that the Lula's case will be solved right away, like next week or next month. He has a lot of space to appeal inside the system, and if you consider how the electoral court behaved in past elections, usually it takes time for them. So they will need to change the approach in Lula's case. They will need to change the way they deal with the process to make it quicker. This is not that much a legal decision, because Lula can manage the appeals, and we talked with a lot of people, and one of them told us, Lula, to get running by the election, he only need to have a good lawyer like Flavio, and he will be able to do that. Okay. So, but there's a political decision as well. It's a pragmatic decision that they can accelerate the process. They can take decisions. They can act differently than they are used to. And this is also a possibility because the electoral justice in Brazil changes really after every 2 years. It changes the compositions of the courts, it changes the jurisprudence. So every new election has a new case, has a new jurisprudence, and that also helps us to not understand if they will change and take a decision right away, preventing Lula to run, or they will letting him appealing as he has the rights to, if he has a good lawyer.
And just a reminder, the electoral court doesn't start ruling or deciding on candidacies until August 15th. That's when they start. The clock hasn't even started ticking for them. So even if Lula gets convicted, goes to jail, is barred by official law, it doesn't matter because it hasn't started on the electoral court yet. So if he files the candidacy, he still has to be analyzed and barred there later.
Yeah, and it is interesting also. So we every election year we have kind of polemics, not as big as this one, but the Ficha Limpa itself was a huge debate in Brazil back in 2010, I think, when they decided to understand if the law could be applied at that year election or not. And usually, Supreme Court tries to be very diligent and try to rule those cases and make all things certain before election, so they did it. It was a mess at the time. I think it was the time that the Supreme Court was missing one member, so you have 10 judges, and at the end of like a 12 hours debate, they had 5 judges against and 5 judges pro, and they couldn't decide, and it was like 2 in the morning, public television broadcasting the discussion. They said, okay, what we do? And they said, okay, let's suspend the discussion and let's come back. So it was a mess, and that president, the former president of the Supreme Court, he didn't want to take the burden of this side, saying that okay, we won't apply, and it was interesting. So they will try to make it, but of course you have. And
you only have 45 days, right? Because the election, the campaign this year is shortened after the Lava Jato scandals broke, and they changed a little bit of the campaign laws. So it used to have 90 days, and now you have 45.
Yes, because people want to avoid so much campaign spending. They minimize, they decrease the election period process to 45 days. One thing is important to note: Lula will be his registration proceedings going to be carried out solely by the Superior Court, the Electoral Court, and it's an easy case. If it's not suspended, they don't need to evaluate any aspect of that case, because it's this under the law. If you have a conviction on that, you are automatically suspended, and the court, the Superior Electoral Court, does not have a say to say, oh no, but this case is differently. They just must apply the law. So it's like a plain fact, easy case to apply the law. The thing is, so this can be done in maybe a week or 2. He can appeal with the decision to the Supreme Court. But in order for him he would have to get an injunction to suspend this decision. That's going to be hard for him. So I think Lula's, he's going to try to do that, as they're saying, but that can be done, that can be decided fast by the Superior Electoral Court.
Maurício.
I always ask that question too, if the system is working. Working for who? Because the single guy says, oh, in my neighborhood, if you steal a chicken to give food to your children, you go to jail without any public defender, you stay there, nobody cares. The politicians, they have the Supreme Court, they have the lawyers. So for the regular folk, this discussion doesn't exist because they don't enjoy the privilege of the system. So this is the good thing, is that I've never seen the system as much exposed as they are right now. So people now are seeing what's happening for the first time. For the first time, actually, the good side that they see politicians going to jail. For example, in the last election, the discussion about the clean record law was like an academic discussion. The people on the ground say, oh, this doesn't exist. Paulo Maluf, a former corrupt politician, was in the ballot, won the election, and people say, if Paulo Maluf is running, there is no clean record law. So that was the general perception. Now Paulo is in jail, finally. But for the regular folk, the system is not working. My neighbor is in jail, he didn't do anything, he's there, and Lula is getting appeal, and AS is got trapped in a record, nothing happened. So this perception doesn't go on the ground, that I haven't seen yet. And actually very similar, in the US people say the same thing, that the system works for people that can pay the lawyer. So this is actually the same thing. So about the online, well, I think online is going to be critical in this election. Well, one, the legal reason. For the first time, the candidates are going to be able to buy online media, and that is the first time. So last time we could not buy like Facebook, Google Media, and now they're going to be able to do it. And there's many a part of the resources are going to that. But for me, the most important thing that will happen is the WhatsApp. People that live in America don't use WhatsApp as much, but in Brazil it's very popular. We have an estimate that we have around 80 million active WhatsApp users in Brazil. We have more than 100 million smartphones. So a lot of political discussion will be held under the WhatsApp environment. And this is good because there is a lot of potential to disseminate content without spending too much. The candidate can record a video in a cell phone and send it to many millions of people. But on the other hand, this is an issue that is being everywhere. It's very easy to disseminate fake news in the WhatsApp environment because it's something. So this is going to be an election held in the cell phones, different from the others that TV and radio was a critical part of the election.
Okay, I see that the panelists conveniently avoid the kingmaker question, and I'm not going to push them on that because we are out of time, but we can talk about that off the record here afterwards. Two final announcements. Jota is partnering with Maurício to analyze the elections and the polls and voter intention throughout the year. So if you're interested in continue to follow this discussion, just join our coverage and you get very interesting, fresh information from us. And we just launched this past Monday a daily review in English. The service is now in English for Jota as well. So if you're interested in receiving our daily information, it's free of charge, and you can just sign up and you get tidbits of relevant news every day in your email. I want to thank all three panelists and Ted very much for allowing us to have this discussion, and all of you for coming today. It's been a pleasure.